a lot of work goes into this, but can you just give us a little bit behind the scenes? Like, how did you actually do this work? How, like, to come up with these numbers of if this, then that? How? Like, it just seems like such a complicated question, right?
You found a research partner. Like, how'd you find that person? Like, we love the nuts and bolts on this podcast of kind of how.
Yeah, go ahead and get a little tactical here. Behind the scenes, if you don't mind sharing.
Because there's a lot of work you probably put into that. So we also want to show that how hard this was for you.
Yeah, it's interesting you ask about that, because part of the work was coming to an answer, and then part of the work was translating it in a way that people could understand, because we were working with PhD researchers at the Urban Institute. So we reached out to the Urban Institute, which is based in DC, and said, here's a question we have. Has anyone else answered this question? Do we just not know that there is already an answer? And they dug around and said, no, actually, this would be the first time we would be trying to quantify this and figure it out. So they were intrigued for the same reason. And we had a team of researchers that worked with us on this question. And then we here locally in Chicago had a team of advisors that was advising the work and pushing and prodding us in different ways as we were getting some of the data back. And what was interesting is that as we started to get some of the data back, one of the ways I remember this conversation really clearly, that where our team at Urban Institute said something along the lines of, well, I mean, it's really like one standard deviation away from XYZ. And I was like, guys, that's not a thing that we can say. So we're going to need to figure out some other ways of conceptualizing this for people. And that's where we got to the median measure, right? Where we said, okay, people can basically understand that we're looking at the top 100 metros in terms of size and, population, and we're ranking them based on economic and racial segregation. And we are saying, if Chicago were to drop to the median, what would we expect based on what we see in those metro regions, based on the outcomes we see in those metro regions? What could we expect to see? And that became the way we conceptualized it, so that people could absorb it and wrap their arms around this information.
And how long did this take? Like, this is years? Is this, this just seems like a huge undertaking.
Yeah, it took about, I think, over a year. I mean, it took a while to get it funded. So we had to get it, get the work funded first, form this group of advisors. Then they did, the first round of analysis. And then we picked and poked at it and said, okay, we need to do some new things to get at new things we hadn't thought about yet, and so on. So it took over a year to do that. And I will say, there's, when you take on something like this, the fundamental anxiety about that is that you don't know what you're going to find at the end, right? It could be that, no, actually, it turns out it does benefit white, wealthy people perfectly well to stay just the way you are. Well, guess what? I'm not interested in trumpeting those findings if that's the result we get, because I'd really like to use this information to help us come up with a shared sense of needing to move in a different direction. But you can't script that. You have to just go with it and see what you find. And that's hard for a lot of people. It's not always easy for a board of directors. It's not always easy for staff to kind of set out on a process of inquiry and not be entirely sure what you're going to find at the end of it.
Well, I think it's really cool. And you had to, for a moment, thought it was cool, and then maybe got scared, like you were just saying. But you went to the Urban Institute, big research on a national level, and you brought a question that no one's even asked or thought of. Like, you had to, like, oh my gosh, I'm on something big here, or, oh no, what am I onto? Like, that had to be like a cool and scary moment for you right there.
Yes, I think there was a very, very long period where it was unclear what this process was going to yield. And so the ability to just sort of sit with that unknown for a long time was a thing.
Yep. So this is what we find in the study. Did you have recommendations moving forward? Like, hey, these are some steps Chicago can take to get moving in the right direction that you've now implemented as commissioner. But what were some of those, I guess, recommendations?
Well, can we take one more step backwards? So, like, you threw out, I jotted a couple of them down, like these big numbers and percentages. Yeah. Like, how are those determined? Like, how like, can you dig a little into more of the numbers or the findings, I guess, before we talk about your solutions?
Yeah. So they did. They ran and back in 2017, I could have answered this a little bit more authoritatively, but many years have passed now. They did a bunch of very advanced analyses and could say with a 90% confidence interval that this is the outcome we could expect to see, because metro regions at the median are experiencing these levels of income, homicides, and bachelor's degrees. Now, the things that didn't hit, because we tested for a lot of things, right? And the things that didn't hit showed that maybe if we changed in that way, it wouldn't make a big difference on life expectancy, let's say, or some of the other measures that we looked at and tried to study. So what we came out with were the things that we did show a big difference on. And what we also showed was that if we continue on as a region on our current path of very slowly, because, you know, it's important to note, white Chicagoans back in 1916 in the start of the Great Migration made some very clear decisions, right, to say when Black Southerners began to migrate north to say, here's where you can live and here's where you can't live, and we will now enforce that for decades, right? Those were decisions that were made. Now, 100 years later, most folks are not actively reinforcing those decisions in the way that they were through legal means and violent means, you know, 100 years ago, but the results remain. And so it was getting sort of marginally better, but what we did do was to map out, look, if we continue on this path, we would not become a substantially less segregated region until I think it was like 60 years from now or something. And so let's look this in the face. Are we really willing to forego 83,000 bachelor's degrees, 30% more homicides, leave 4 billion on the table, or 8 billion as a region? Are we really willing to forego that? Or are we willing to do some things differently? That was really the question we were putting out there. So to your question, Tom, we divided it into two efforts. So the first effort was to find, is there a cost? And if so, here's what it is. The second effort was, what do we do about it? And I actually found that one to be much more difficult of a process. That took another year. And we had about 100 advisors that time. And we spent a bunch of time on the question of, if you wanted to do something substantial about the issue of racial and economic segregation, what would you be doing differently? And it was a super just fascinating and really important process for me as a person and as a leader and all of this, because I think that an assumption one might make, if you come out saying, here's all these negatives about segregation, well, then you might be assuming that the answer is to say, how do we become super integrated as a city and as a region? And what we learned in the process was that integration is not the end goal. And the end goal really is racial equity.